أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد الأمين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين آمين يا رب العالمين. Dear respected viewers, I welcome you back to this episode of your show live from the holy city of Karbala. We are on Back to the Basics, in which we shall be discussing a basic approach to returning back to the basic fundamentals of our differences with those who do not follow the same path and indeed the same aqidah as our own. Of course, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, it would not be befitting, nor would it do any justice to the topic at hand for me to try to give you a very brief summary. So all I can do is hope that you might gain a context from watching this episode, and for those of you who are so confused that this episode does not help, you may return back to the previous episodes for a further elucidation and context of what we are discussing. Of course, we are discussing the worldview now of those who possess the title Christians for themselves, those who call themselves Christians and those who belong to what we could call our estranged Abrahamic cousin, the religion which likewise, like Islam, is very much so a missionary religion. We have many things in common, such as our belief that salvation is found through particularly our doctrine, and our belief that we possess the absolute truth. Of course, these similarities are also joined with the fact that we share a similarity in the number of prophets we believe in. For example, you would find that Christians believe in all of the biblical prophets, that is to say the prophets mentioned in the Old Testament. They believe in Abraham, hence why we are the estranged Abrahamic cousin of Christianity, in the sense that we all claim to go back to the God of Abraham, namely the deity whom we name Allah Azza wa Jal, the ones who the Christians would name Yahweh. Now, despite the fact there is a similarity in text of the name, namely God, there is a substantial difference between our understanding of God and theirs. And of course, we had been discussing the Trinity, because we mentioned in any discussion pertaining to worldview, one of the first things we want to be discussing is the theology of that worldview. Namely, what do they believe about God? What is the nature of God, and what is the nature of God's interaction with human beings? So, in discussing the Trinity, we wanted to accurately represent the Trinity and the Christian view of the Trinity to the best of our ability. In doing so, we were citing from an article yesterday from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, written by a very capable philosopher by the name of Dale Tuggy. And he has many things to say about the historical development of the doctrine of the Trinity. We had gotten to page 4 yesterday, and I'm just going to repeat where we left off because it was quite a speedily ended episode. Dale Tuggy states, many Christian apologists argue that the doctrine of the Trinity is biblical, i.e., either it is implicitly taught there, or it is the best explanation of what is there. Using the three sorts of arguments, they begin by claiming that the Father of Jesus Christ is the one true God taught in the Old Testament. They then argue that given what the Bible teaches about Christ and the Holy Spirit, they must be fully divine as well. Thus, we must, as it were, move them within the nature of the one God. Therefore, there are three fully divine persons in God, he states. While this may be paradoxical, it is argued that this is what God has revealed to humankind throughout the Bible. The type of arguments employed to show the full divinity of Christ and the Holy Spirit work as follows. So he's elaborating upon the kind of logic and rhetoric and reasoning utilized by those who wish to make forward, or put forward rather, an argument to state that Christ is divine or part of the Godhead. Their arguments would go like this. 1. S did action A. That is to say, S performed action A according to the Bible. 2. for any X, if X does action A, X is fully divine. 3, therefore S is fully divine. So to give you that in less philosophical jargon, let me break that down. Let's take the analogy of forgiving sins. The type of reasoning utilized by the Christians would go such: Jesus forgave sins. Anyone who does action of forgiving sins is fully divine. Therefore, Jesus is fully divine. That would be the kind of reasoning that the Christians use. Now, of course, they're not far off from the reasoning utilized by our Salafi friends, who would argue as well that because Allah knows the unseen, anyone else who also knows the unseen has apparently been raised to Godhead. Or because Allah creates, anyone who now has been given the gift to create now belongs to the Godhead as well, according to their foul and skewed understanding of theological principles. So we can understand where the Christians have gone wrong. E.g., A equals non-culpably pronouncing the forgiveness of sins, non-culpably receiving worship, raising the dead, saying before Abraham I was, and creating the cosmos. So the argument would be that Jesus has quality Q. Anyone that has quality Q would be divine, therefore Jesus is divine. Now, I'll quote Dale Tucky in what he states here. While such arguments are deductively valid, they suffer from a crucial ambiguity. What is meant by fully divine? Until this is made clear, it isn't clear of which of the Trinitarian theories is being argued for. That is to say, dear viewers, that there are numerous Trinitarian models. There are numerous models of the Trinity, and you'll still find some of these models amongst Protestant theologians. The Eastern Orthodox Church tends to be quite divided from the rest of its brethren when it comes to, well, not the Eastern Orthodox Church, but we'll take the Coptic Church, for example. The Coptic Church in Egypt is quite divided from the rest of the churches when it comes to the nature of Jesus as well. So there are several differences on what this model entails. Until this is made clear, it isn't clear which of the Trinitarian theories is being argued for. A person being fully divine might, according to various theorists, amount to being constituted by the matter-like divine nature, being identical to God, being a mind of God, being a way God relates to himself or the world, and so on. Further, the epistemic status of each argument's second premise may depend upon what divine means. So, the respected author of this article, Dr. Dale Tucky, is arguing that the utilization of a word here for divine is very ambiguous, and until such a thing is defined, we can't really proceed any further. And this is something you will notice in debates done with Christians. James White, for example, particular scholarly gentleman, he likes to use the word the God-man. And he'll like to say things like, of course, a human being can't do these things. And of course, a human being is limited. And of course, God can't be a human being. But the God-man can. And what he's done is he's just created a new word, the God-man, as if it solved the problem. Now, if you ask what the God-man is, it still suffers from the same problems as God becoming a man. It's not really resolved anything, but there's an ability to hide behind this level of ambiguity. Opponents of these sorts of arguments typically give biblical counterexamples to the second premise. Namely, human beings are called God all the time in the Bible without being recognized as being divine. In other cases, they also challenge the first premise, and they would state that Jesus, according to the Bible, denied being omniscient, and there are good grounds to deny that Jesus created the cosmos. So, another form of argument which would be used here would run as follows. Passage E is a true prophecy predicting that the God of Israel, Yahweh, will do action A. Passage F truly asserts that the prophecy of E was fulfilled in the life of Jesus. therefore Jesus is the God of Israel, Yahweh. This is one of the arguments used by some Christians who wish to read that Trinity into the New Testament. Now, the reason that such an argument is invalid according to Del Tuggy is the following. It is possible for the premises to be true even though the conclusion is false. Even though the prediction, George W. Bush will conquer Iraq, may be said to be fulfilled by the actions of General Smith, it doesn't follow that Smith and Bush are one and the same. Rather, Smith acted as an agent of George W. Bush. Similarly, Yahweh acts through his servant and prophet Jesus. Another disadvantage of this argument is that if it is sound, the conclusion is undesirable. If Jesus and God are held to be numerically identical, and one adds that the Father is fully divine in the same sense, i.e. the Father is numerically identical to God, then it logically follows that Jesus is just the Father. And yet, according to all Trinitarians, Jesus is the Son and not the Father. And so this argument ends up opening a can of worms, and as the author states, is something which appears contradictory but is in fact true. Rather, what he states in full is, this is why nearly all Trinitarian theories decline to identify more than one of the three persons with God. On the other hand, some embrace this as a mystery, something which appears contradictory, but is in fact true. And this is what I talked about. That ability for the average human intellect to say, I believe firmly in the law of non-contradiction. I believe firmly in the law of excluded middle. But when it comes to the theology, say, no, look, it's God we're talking about. Let's throw these laws down the drain. Everything which is known to be contradictory now becomes sound. We need to learn to respect the institution of knowledge slightly better. To respect that the mind has been given to us by God, and that these principles, which every intelligent soul is able to recognize without them having a presence in the natural world, is in fact a truly valid principle. Dear viewers, we need to ensure that our minds are not dismissed when it comes to understanding revelation, especially since with a doctrine like the Trinity, what we are seeing is that there's no texts which clearly outline the doctrine. So if it's the mind that has inferred the doctrine, then we need to ensure that we don't use that same mind to shut down when questioning the doctrine. We're going to go for a very short break, inshallah ta'ala, and when we get back, I'll elaborate more. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, welcome back. I was stating before the break that we need to ensure that our mind doesn't infer a doctrine using the intellect only to thereafterwards behead itself and say that, look, at the end of the day it's God, I'm not going to try and use my mind anymore. Because this is where absurdity lies. What I mean by that is, if a doctrine appears contradictory, not merely beyond our ability to understand it, but actually contradictory, it violates the law of non-contradiction. We need to ensure that we don't affirm it and pass it off as the divine mystery. Otherwise, we'll affirm all sorts of non-rational things, non-rational beliefs, and affirm them as mysteries as well. Continuing. This traditional case for the divinity of Jesus and the Holy Spirit may be best construed not as a collection of deductive arguments, but rather as an inference to the best explanation, an attempt to infer what best explains all the biblical texts considered together. In this genre, however, alternative explanations are rarely explored in any detail, much less shown to be inferior. Many arguments of the above types date back to ancient times and have been repeated in similar forms whether mainstream Trinitarianism has been attacked. A number of well-developed refutations of these arguments dating from the 17th to 19th centuries have been largely forgotten by present-day theologians, philosophers, and apologists. Now, why would there be a number of these refutations? Well, there would be because you have to understand this time was a very popular time for what we call the free-thinking movement, a movement of those who were more inclined towards rationality and drifted towards a form of Unitarianism. They saw the massive problems of the Trinity. And so this is where the roots of the modern day Unitarian movement find their seeds, find their original origins, really. We find it in the 17th and 18th century, and until today you still have a few Unitarian congregations in the United Kingdom. Certainly you have them in America, where they're known as the Unitarian Universalists, but unfortunately they tend to be so liberal that they wouldn't hold a single theological truth soundly. Some people might believe that the Jehovah's Witnesses are of the same stock of Unitarianism. They're not. Jehovah's Witnesses are really binitarians, and the reason I say that is because they don't believe in a Trinity, but rather they believe that Jesus is a created God. He's a second God. They affirm that he's a God. They actually call him a God, but they say that he is nonetheless created. He's a God with an origin. So let's now look at the development of creeds up until the year 325 CE. Early Christianity, the author states, was theologically diverse, though as time went on, a Catholic movement, a bishop-led developing organization which, at least from the 2nd century, claimed to be the true successors of Jesus' apostles, became increasingly dominant, outcompeting many Gnostic and quasi-Jewish groups. Now let me explain this Gnostic and quasi-Jewish groups. You have in the early Christian community a very diverse set of groups. You have a group which retains the identity of Judaism, and these groups are generally affiliated with James, the brother of Jesus. Now, James, the brother of Jesus, according to Christian tradition. Now, I'm not affirming that Jesus had a brother by the name of James, but these groups are generally affiliated with James, the brother of Jesus. And you had these quasi-Gnostic groups as well. These Gnostic groups were generally continuations of these weird, elitist, botany, law-shunning groups which claimed that the old God of the Old Testament was an evil God created by man, and that the true God is Jesus, and that he came to set people free by teaching them true wisdom. Now, of course, these groups are all dead now, thankfully so, but these were the early groups that existed at that time. Still confining our attention to what scholars now call this Catholic or Proto-Orthodox Christianity, it contained divergent views about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. No theologian in the first 3 Christian centuries was a Trinitarian in the sense of believing that the one God is tripersonal, containing equally divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, this claim is a little bit, it's a little bit daring, and so I will concede to the principle in my discussions of Christians that there is a good principle known as absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But I would still say that the absence of evidence is quite scary. So, whilst I'll confirm that you do have statements elevating Jesus to a form of Godhead, you do have statements elevating the Holy Spirit very highly, to find me a creed from the first 3 centuries, whilst we do certainly have writings from the first 3 centuries, clearly outlining the doctrine of the Trinity, I've never seen someone successfully do it. Now, it's not to say that no one held these beliefs, but it is curious and strange that even their founding fathers, the church fathers, the ones who existed from those first 3 centuries, we don't know what they believed in this regard. The term we translate as Trinity, that is to say the Latin Trinitas and the Greek Trias, seems to have come into use only in the last 2 decades of the 2nd century. But such usage doesn't reflect Trinitarian belief. These late 2nd and 3rd century authors use such terms not to refer to the one God, but rather to refer to the plurality of the one God, together with his Son and his Spirit. They profess a Trinity, triad, or threesome, but not a triune or tripersonal God. Nor did they consider these to be equally divine. A common strategy for defending monotheism in this period is to emphasize the unique divinity of the Father. Hence, this is what we find when we go back to the books of Origen, who died in the year 255. The God and Father who holds the universe together is superior to every being that exists. This is a quote from Origen, of course. For he imparts to each one from his own existence that which each one is. The Son, being less than the Father, is superior to rational creatures alone, for he is second to the Father. The Holy Spirit is still less and dwells within the saints alone, so that in this way the power of the Father is greater than that of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and that of the Son is more than that of the Holy Spirit. So again, this would fall under that which we were talking about yesterday, where the earliest Christian writings we have seem to have been influenced by this hierarchical belief found within early Neoplatonism, namely that the Father is the only God, the Father is the only God, he creates the Son, and afterwards we have this hierarchy in terms of a creating scale, where one creates the other creates the other, and powers descend and go down, and greatness descends and goes down as the chain reaches ourselves. Many scholars call this strain of Christian theology subordinationist, as the Son and Spirit are always, in some sense, derivative of, less than, and subordinate to their source, the one God that is the Father. One may call this theology Unitarian in the sense that the one God is just the Father and not equally the Son and Spirit, and so that the one God is unipersonal. So again, this is not the model of the Trinity that we have today. Even though, of course, we Muslims would not say that this is decent theology, we would still say it's not the model that we have today. While views about the Spirit remained comparatively undeveloped, and as in the New Testament, the Spirit was not worshipped, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Catholic Christianity came to attribute a divine nature to Jesus, and to firmly establish his being called God, language which has been very unusual in the 1st century, now became the norm. Jesus was now known as God or a God, but not the true God. This is what we find from reading the books of people like Justin Martyr, of course. This divine Son, i.e. the pre-human Jesus, was mysteriously generated, this doctrine of faith, by God either just before creation or in timeless eternity. While these developments were new, the worship of Jesus was not. As against earlier theories that it developed only slowly and because of Gentile influence, recent work has shown that Jesus was worshipped alongside God in the earliest known Christianity. Now this would demonstrate that there is this trend from the earliest period of Christianity, that there is at least one school that worshipped Jesus. Now this is from the work of Larry Hurtado. While the basis cited for this practice in the New Testament is God's post-resurrection exaltation of Jesus, it is now assumed that its basis was Jesus having something divine within him. So what we see here is we have a plethora of different ideas which shaped early Christianity. And these plethora of different ideas, we now have people trying to reconcile it and make sense of it, because you're struggling to look for evidence of your beliefs, and you're going to go back and look and see, well, someone had this belief, someone had that belief. But what we see is many of these factors are often blown out of proportion by the Trinitarians. I'm not trying to belittle the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. I think that, rationally speaking, we certainly have good enough grounds to reject it as certainly not a monotheistic model, to say the very least. But more importantly than that, we can see that there's been a massive development, a development which doesn't exist from the earliest inception of Jesus' companions. And more importantly, the sources themselves are equally as dubious. So really, what we're looking at is a worldview which not only undermines our ability to know anything again by claiming that God is just a mystery, but more importantly, actually undermines our ability to know anything about ourselves. And we'll come to the reason for that in due time, inshallah ta'ala. When we look at this mix and match of early doctrines which led to the formation of Christianity, it is very important to understand that what people believe in today is merely those things that they have inherited. You see, we always have the hindsight of assuming that history was uniform to our own times and that doctrines were shaped in the early times and that we've merely inherited them. And of course, there's not a grand conspiracy that they were just shaped 20 years ago or 500 years ago, for example. But such is not always the case. Dear viewers, thank you for joining me once more. And inshallah ta'ala, in the next episode, I'll continue to elaborate on the doctrine of Trinity and some of the issues we have with it. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Oh